the last study, as it were, of Gideon's life. Now, confession from me, we're not going to quite finish everything today, mainly because we won't have time. We're not going to cover the ephod story, but we can talk about that afterwards. However, we have a bit to cover as we try and get our way through the battle and the subsequent pursuit of the rest of the Midianites as Gideon takes them out. But just to recap very quickly, remember we've been on the journey with Gideon as God teaches Gideon about learning to build trust, all right? That the first thing he had to do was to look back in history. You remember that from our first session? Look back at history and learn and get confidence about the fact that God will work with you. Then we have to get rid of idols and deal with things at home. And then we have to lead by example and choose attitude over aptitude, right? And then we have to think about, as we go through our life, to have that courage that we need to have, that conviction in God, and that God will help us see that we can trust Him, we can gain courage, and that being fearful is still there, but we have more trust that God will save us and protect us if we have confidence in Him. But that it will never take away the fact that we still have our mortality in this life. And now He takes him to the brink of the battle, and the battle's in front of him, and ensures it. And as we saw in our last session, effectively, without a sword in their hand, a pitcher in one hand and a lamp in the other, they are watching as every man's sword is going against his neighbor. We pick up the story in verse 21, and look, it says, and they stood every man in his place round about the camp, and all the host ran and cried and fled. And the 300 blew the trumpets, and Yahweh set every man's sword. If you've got a pencil, just underline that. Yahweh set every man. This is not Gideon or his 300 men. Yahweh's doing this. That Yahweh set every man's sword against his fellow, even throughout all the host. And the host fled to Bethshittah, into Zerath, and to the border of Abel-Maholah, unto Tibbath. And so they are set to run. And every man, Gideon and his men, stood back as the sword of the Lord slew every man his neighbor. And there was not a sword in Gideon or his man's hand. And so God worked so mightily that the host took off with Gideon's men in hot pursuit. And in verse 23 it says that the men of Israel gathered themselves together. The tribes that had been sent back as fearful ones now join in the battle from Naphtali and Asher and out of Manasseh, and they pursue after the Midianites, pouring out of their tents from home to join the chase. But Gideon could see how quickly they were escaping, right? And so he sends messages ahead to all the inhabitants of Mount Ephraim. So he sent messengers, it says, verse 24, throughout all Mount Ephraim, saying, come now down against the Midianites and take them before the waters unto Beth-barah and Jordan, the house of the fords. Come down to the house of the fords and to the Jordan, where they're likely to get across. If you can take that area, you can stop them escaping it. So it says, then all the men of Ephraim gathered themselves together and took the waters unto Beth-barah and to Jordan. The goal was to cut off the enemy before they got across the river. They almost did it, by the way. They almost stopped them completely. From the story, in Judges chapter 8 and verse 10, what we're told is there were 120,000 men of the Midianites who were of the Midianitish host and the children of the east, and only 15,000 of them got across that border before the rest of them were all destroyed. So they almost got them all, but 15,000 managed to sneak through the gap before the fords were fully taken. But in the process, the men of Ephraim had gathered and stopped a vast number, and the children of Israel had slain a vast number, and they took, it says, the two princes of the Midianites, Oreb and Zeb. And they slew Oreb upon the rock Oreb, and Zeb they slew at the winepress of Zeb. And they pursued the Midianites and brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon on the other side of Jordan. And so they took the forts. The men of Ephraim managed to capture them. What a battle, what a chase, what a night. All in this moment, not only had they achieved the impossible, because they had been subdued, Midian had subdued them for 7 years, Not only had they achieved the impossible, but the enemies had now been completely overcome. They'd been chased back onto the other side of Jordan, and they'd slain thousands upon thousands of them. It was a clean sweep of the land. No more Midianites were to be found. And in the process, Israel had been united in battle and now convinced that God indeed was in control. It was a marvelous victory. But as they picked through the battlefield, looking for the kings of Midian, I couldn't find them. And you know what, brothers and sisters? Not everyone was happy. Not everyone was convinced that the outcome that had been achieved was the best. And Gideon is now going to come. I might just move this. I can see what slides are coming next, you see. Gideon is now going to find out that leading and motivating others isn't easy. In fact, to appreciate everything that you've seen as a leader and to try and teach everybody else to understand what you understand isn't always straightforward. And working with others isn't as clear-cut as we'll expect, and it's no different in ecclesial life. Do you know, Gideon's now going to come face to face with a bunch of people that didn't share the same passion and enthusiasm and lessons as Gideon had. We're going to come back to the story of Zeb and Zalmunna in a minute, because Gideon's going to realize that he needs to share the lessons that he'd learned. You see, he's going to come face to face with the men of Ephraim, men of resentment and indignation, some sheer arrogance and pride in their own ability. And if they'd been called, well, there'd been a totally different outcome. If you'd asked us in the beginning, well, we wouldn't have had this problem, Gideon. Then he's going to come to the men of Succoth and Penuel, those that just show outright hostility and cowardice. They don't want to choose sides. They want to play Switzerland. They don't really care for the battle. It's not my problem. Then he's going to come across his firstborn son and going to show an element of naivety and immaturity because his own son doesn't fully understand the importance of eradicating the enemy, to destroy them, to cut off its head, to get rid of them forever. Instead of a supreme victory, brothers and sisters, with the whole nation absolutely ecstatic, with a magnificent military conquest, Gideon runs straight into a battle of human pride, lack of brotherly love, and ecclesial indifference, a complete lack of understanding and wisdom experienced in the multitude that he was trying to save. And brothers and sisters, it's a cameo of ecclesial life. You see, in the highs and the lows of ecclesial life, we can see all of these people along the way, either experiencing the roadblocks or being the roadblocks. What we hope to do in our study this afternoon is we want to see how Gideon responds to each of these groups, how he handles each of them, so that we can gain valuable lessons about how we don't become the roadblock, and if we see the roadblocks, how we can help each other learn and navigate our way through them, so that we gain those valuable insights as we journey in faith. And what we're going to find is that Gideon inevitably tries to teach them and teach the 300 men that were with him the same lessons that he'd been taught by God all the way through his life in terms of how to build trust and how to build faith. So what was the first group? The men of Ephraim. Well, we pick up the story in Judges chapter 8 and verse 1. As the news of the battle and its success reaches Gideon, he receives the dripping heads of Oreb and Zeb at the hands of the men of Ephraim. Now, pick up the story and it says, well, at the end of verse 25, it says, and they pursued Midian and brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon on the other side of Jordan. And along with the heads comes much more than he bargained for. Because with those heads comes an unbelievable unimaginable attitude from some men who were utterly miffed at not being called first. And so they turned. Judges chapter 8 and verse 1. The men of Ephraim said unto him, Why hast thou served us thus, that thou callest us not when thou wentest to fight with the Midianites? What an attitude. Did you imagine it? Gideon's ecstatically excited about what they've actually managed to achieve. And these men turn up, the ones he'd called to help, with this stink attitude, unbelievable attitude. Their accusation to Gideon was that they felt like they were the last-minute ringers. We're the last minute of all people. We were the last ones to be called, Gideon. What were you thinking? Look, honestly, you should have called us. You should have called us in first. We've got the job done properly. This is ridiculous. Look, we've only got these couple of little hits here, and 15,000 have escaped, Gideon. What were you thinking? Why did these men of Ephraim feel that they were so extra special? Well, when you go through history, brothers and sisters, the men of Ephraim had a pride problem. You see, they were extremely proud of their heritage. This was the family and tribe where all the greats of Israel had come from. You see, this was Joshua's tribe, the place of his inheritance, Joshua 24, verse 30. You see, it was Ephraim where Joseph's inheritance and burial place was, in Joshua 24, verse 32. Phinehas himself, who was a Levite but a high priest, well, he chose to be buried in the area of Ephraim. And throughout history, when we look at Isaiah 9 and we look at Isaiah 23, verse 3, throughout history, this proud and arrogant spirit of this tribe was manifested time and time and time again. They felt, as fifth-generation Christadelphians, that they knew better. And their point, when they turned up to Gideon, was, well, hey, look, if you'd come to us first, we'd actually understand the problem, Gideon. Like, we would have got this sorted properly. You know, you should have engaged our thinking. We're experienced at this. You should have come to us first. And now 15,000 of these men have escaped. What were you thinking? And it wasn't, brothers and sisters, a snide passing comment. Look what it says in verse 1. They did chide with him sharply. Literally, they did strive with him violently or mightily. These were furious men. They were outraged. They were on the verge of fisticuffs, fighting their own people because they felt left out. Such was their arrogance that they, after their quarrel with Gideon, they simply just walk off and leave Gideon and the 300 men to finish the battle. Do you know the problem with these men, brothers and sisters? Do you know what they hadn't thought about? They hadn't stopped to think that God might have been working behind the scenes. They had no appreciation for what Gideon and these 300 men had actually accomplished. You know, you could have had 7 years at this, boys. And you're coming to us when the battle is almost done. You had 7 years. You have no appreciation for what's actually been done for them on this occasion. They didn't realize that God had handpicked 300 men for the job, specifically. No appreciation whatsoever. And more than that, do you know what they didn't appreciate? They had no appreciation that they were actually now stopping Gideon from finishing the job. They were standing in their way. Their arrogant attitude was focused more on the poor performance and outcome of what they had done and what could have been achieved if they'd been called first. It's a disgusting attitude, brothers and sisters. Frightful. But unfortunately, ecclesial life is not without our men of Ephraim. You see, we can all suffer from the men of Ephraim syndrome, can't we? Especially when we have skills or experiences in areas in ecclesial life. Just because we might be good at something, it doesn't necessarily make us the best people for the job. You see, God was looking at an attitude, not aptitude, on this occasion. And these men would never have made God's cut, would they? You know, sometimes I think when we see things that are not done as well as we'd like them done, or not done as efficiently as we would have done, or not as perfect, or not as organized, we can manifest the spirit of Ephraim, the men of Ephraim, can't we, brothers and sisters? Why is it that we manifest the same spirit? You see, it's because we're thinking about ourselves and what we'd have done and how we'd have done it better, rather than seeking or trying to see how God might have worked with somebody else and how they have done it to achieve a purpose that God might have been working to. You see, we've got to stop. It's not always about us, brothers and sisters. We can all suffer from the spirited attitude of the men of Ephraim at times, I think. That can be seen in catering or organisation or administration or exhorts or committees or announcements or whatever it is. If we're focused on ourselves and we're not seeing how God's working, we can become the men of Ephraim. So how do we handle a men of Ephraim attitude? Well, Gideon shows us how. You see, it's not actually easy to manage a man of Ephraim. But look at how Gideon turns the story around. This could have been in a lot of a really different outcome. It's just as easy to reciprocate the same spirit in defense, isn't it, when we're attacked by someone who's telling us they would have done a better job. And if we reciprocate the spirit, it's not the right outcome, is it? We've got to learn to have Gideon gentleness in the way that he treats them. Proverbs 15 says, a soft answer turneth away wrath. You see, the men of Ephraim were seeking to say that they could have done a better job. And do you know what Gideon does, brothers and sisters? He acknowledges that they might have. What he focuses on, he says, you've already done a better job than I have. It's all good. You've done a much better job. But more importantly, look at how God's working with you already. Look at how God's at work. Look what he says. Verse 2. What have I done now when compared to you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiezer? See what he says? He says, you reckon you've got the dregs, but I tell you, it's much better than the handful of grapes you think I've got. God hath delivered into your hands the princes of Midian, Oreb and Zeb. And what have I been able to do in comparison to you? You see how Gideon works? You see, Gideon's careful response focuses the men of Ephraim on two key things. The first key thing was, you've actually achieved a greater outcome than I have in this battle. So yes, you're right. You could have done a better job. You've already done a better job. But more importantly, do you know what I think you need to think about, says Gideon, is you need to see God's hand in this. Look at what God has done, not what I have done. Stop thinking about it from my perspective. Look at it from how God's thinking about this. And you see, Gideon encourages them to think beyond themselves. You see, for 7 years, God had delivered them into the hand of Midian, and now in one night, God had reversed it. It was the start of something special. You need to think beyond yourself. You need to think bigger than this. You need to see the bigger picture. And thus, by encouraging, think about that. It says their anger was abated toward him. God hath delivered into your hands the princes of Midian, Oreb, and Zeb. And what was I able to do in comparison to you? And their anger was abated toward him when he had said that. You see, there's a massive lesson for us, isn't there, brothers and sisters, when it comes to winning friends and influence people. You see, when confronted by criticism, rather than reacting, let's try and understand where people are coming from and acknowledge where skills and experiences might be, that people may be more suitably qualified to comment. But what we have to try and show each other is what God has taught us to try and help us diffuse a situation. That's always going to be the way. We need to see God at work in everyone, to approach one another with humility and to encourage each other with love and to good works. You see, we need to encourage each other to see the bigger picture. So whenever we see criticism, let's try and see God at work and encourage each other to see God at work and to acknowledge where strengths and weaknesses lie. And so Gideon averts a crisis. The men of Ephraim leave him, and he takes off in pursuit. Verse 4, and Gideon came to Jordan and passed over, he and the 300 men that were with him, faint, yet pursuing. You see, he takes off, and yet this is only going to be the start of Gideon's learning about the fact that working and winning others for God isn't easy, and it's definitely not straightforward. And he runs on, and it says he came to Jordan and passed over. The 300 men that were with him. Mind you, that's a really interesting statement, isn't it? 300 men that were with him. What does that tell us about the battle thus far? Midianites, 105,000 gone. Gideon, 0. 300 men were still with him, not one gone, not one lost. But now they're faint yet pursuing. Do you know that's probably one of those oxymorons? Well, not it's an oxymoron, it's a euphemism, isn't it? Faint yet pursuing. Do you know it's helpful to set a little bit of context in this battle? From the men in the hill of Moreh, from the battle that was there, to the crossing of the Jordan next to Bethabara. Do you know how long that is? It's approximately 45 kilometres. Do you know how big a marathon is? 42.2 Ks. So these men that were with Gideon had just run a marathon chasing the Midianites. 45 Ks. They'd put over a marathon to chase these men. They'd fought a battle, run a marathon, carrying weapons, killing people as they went. They were absolutely had it. And the record says they were faint yet pursuing. And that's a spirit and an attitude, brothers and sisters, that we all have to have in life. No matter how tired we are, we've got to be faint yet pursuing. That's a massive thing. And it was a huge run, wasn't it? The adrenaline was wearing off, and now the hunger was setting in. And so approaching Succoth, Gideon requests for help and support for the food for his men. You see, these men in Succoth hadn't responded to the call. They were stuck over the other side of Jordan. And perhaps now we know why. You see, these men had decided to play Switzerland. And by that I mean that they decided to be neutral and to sit on the fence. They didn't want to take sides. You see, if the Midianites came back, then they'd be the first ones to cop it because they would be the first ones back if the Midianites were going to chase them back through. And so if to show favour to Gideon to his men was to surefire and get the annihilation from the Midianites on their return. But if they showed no favoritism at all, then they couldn't really be any form of implication or retribution on either side, surely. See, their spirit, brothers and sisters, well, this isn't really my battle to fight, so I won't get involved. So it says, verse 6, or verse 5, and he said to the men of Succoth, give, I pray you, loaves of bread unto the people that follow me, for they be faint, for I am pursuing after Zebah and Zalmunna, kings of Midian. And the princes of Succoth said, are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna in thine hand, that we should give bread unto thine army? You see, the men of Succoth's morals showed utter contempt and a lack of trust in God and his calling and Gideon's support for the matter. They showed no sign that they understood that God had taken out the enemy, even despite the facts that the Midianites had just been routed and running for their life. It was an appalling response, wasn't it, brothers and sisters? They were more worried about potential retribution than they were in potential victory. It was absolutely disgraceful spirit that these men showed. We don't want to pick sides, because that could be dangerous for us. We'd be never like that, would we, brothers and sisters? You see, when challenges arise in ecclesial lives, we'd never try to play the Switzerland card and bury our heads in the sand and hope the problem will go away, will we? Do we? We'd never sit by watching our brethren potentially suffer just because our life is much easier if we play a neutral game. See, brothers and sisters, I think sometimes not only can we be the arrogant, self-assertive men of Ephraim, but I think sometimes we might be a little bit apathetic and inconsiderate men of Succoth too. Unwilling to declare our hand, potentially not get involved for fear of involving ourselves in something that's bigger or, quite frankly, something we can't be bothered to try and deal with. And by the way, brothers and sisters, I'm not saying that we need to get involved in everyone else's business all the time. However, if we become aware of our brethren in need and certain un-Christ-like behaviour, things that are going on around them, and we choose not to support them, then we are no better than the men of Succoth, are we? You see, the amazing thing was that the men of Succoth had no appreciation for God's hand, no appreciation for Gideon's sacrifice, no understanding of the 300 men's willingness to die on behalf of them, to deliver everybody from the Midianite hand. See, 1 John 3 tells us, through the words of the Apostle John, "Whoso hath this world's goods, and seeing his brother have need, and shutteth up his bowels of compassion for him, how dwelleth the love of God in him?" 1 John 3 verse 17. You see, there's no room for passive and neutral Christadelphians in God's kingdom. There's only two seeds, brothers and sisters. We're either fighting for God and Christ, or we're not. We've got to choose which side we're going to be on, and we've got to fight for the seed of the woman like there's no tomorrow. And just look at Gideon's response to these men. Verse 7, Gideon says, "Therefore," and note the emphasis, if you've got a colouring in pencil, what was the way he treated the men of Ephraim? Verse 3, "God hath delivered into your hands." How does Gideon respond to the men of Succoth? "Therefore, when Yahweh hath delivered Zebah and Zalmunna into mine hand." All right, there's a link between these two things. When you see that God's at work, then you'll understand. When Yahweh hath delivered Zebah and Zalmunna into mine hand, then I will tear your flesh with the thorns of the wilderness and with briars. Note the margin. I will thresh you, is what he says. I'm going to rip these wilderness briars out, and I'm going to thresh you like I would with wheat. Why does he do this? Well, perhaps, brothers and sisters, there's two reasons. Perhaps one is because he was asking for bread. The poetic justice that was requiring. He says, if you won't give me bread, I'll get bread out of you by beating it out of you. Or perhaps the second reason is, if you put a note in your margin, Joshua 23 verse 13. "If ye go back and cleave unto the remnant of these nations," Joshua 23:13, "know for a surety that I will no more drive out these nations from before you, but they shall be snares and traps unto you, and scourges in your sides, and thorns in your eyes, until ye perish from off this good land wherewith Yahweh have given you." He says, I'm going to rip those thorns, and I'm going to beat you with them, as God said. If you go down this channel, we're only going to land back where we were. Joshua 23:13. But perhaps there's a third and more holistic approach that Gideon is taking to teach the men of Succoth and the 300 men that were with him, and in fact all Israel. Do you know, I think we're given some details in Judges chapter 7, verse 25, when it says that the two princes, Orb and Zeb, were killed at a rock called Orb and a winepress called Zeb. You see, after the death of these two men, they named them. And Gideon finds out they destroyed them at a rock and a winepress. Do you know, for Gideon, that started him thinking, I think, brothers and sisters. It had all started, the whole story of Gideon's faithfulness and his development began at a rock and a winepress. And for Gideon, I think he began to see what the big problem was. You see, these men hadn't seen what he'd seen. These men hadn't understood what God had taught him. And now I have to try and teach the nation of Israel and the 300 men that were with me all the lessons that I myself have been taught. And he realizes that perhaps he had reacted a little bit like the men of Ephraim. Well, where's all the miracles that my fathers have spoken about concerning this land? Why has God put us like this? This doesn't seem fair. Oh, this is unreasonable. You see, he realized that he had manifested a little bit of the spirit of the men of Ephraim. Why is all this befallen us? Why are all the miracles? Yahweh has forsaken us and delivered us into the hand of the Midianites. Judges 6:13. And God had worked a miraculous miracle at the winepress as Gideon was threshing wheat to make bread. And here is Gideon, faint yet pursuing like he was back then. And as he crosses the Jordan, Gideon sees a cameo of the old Gideon and understood the needs to show everyone what God had taught him so that they too might understand what he had learnt. You see, the pursuit of the Midianites, I think, for Gideon at this point of his life, he realized that this was emblematic of his entire journey of faith and trust in God. And he needs to share the learnings with them. Perhaps now we can see why Gideon chooses the punishments, not only for the men of Succoth, but also for the men of Penuel. You see, for the men of Succoth who refused food for his army, Gideon decides to thresh them. For the men of Penuel who refuses food, it says that he was going to come, and what was he going to do? Says verse 9, I will break down this tower. That expression is exactly the same expression cast down of the altar of chapter 6, verse 28. See, I think Gideon is going to teach the nation what he had been taught by God. Gideon saw that God had shown him a great deal on his journey of faith and his trust, and he saw his responsibility now was to teach others in God's ways. When God hath done this, then you will know. And now he wasn't afraid anymore of his father's house. He wasn't even afraid of any men of whatever city. It didn't matter because Yahweh was going to be with him. All things were possible. Brothers and sisters, that's our job too. See, God teaches us lessons in life, not just for our benefit, but that it might motivate us to teach others, that they too might be perfected alongside us, that we may share the wonders of God's grace with each other about the things we learn. And Gideon does this as he comes. And as he leaves the men of Succoth and comes to Penuel, verse 8, that says, and he spake unto them likewise, and the men of Penuel answered him as the men of Succoth had answered him. Gideon's response when he says, he says, when I come again in peace, the altar that he had built. Remember, the altar of Judges chapter 6, Yahweh Shalom. When I come again in peace, he says, I break down this tower. You see, unlike the men of Succoth, who were worried about retribution, the difference between them and the men of Penuel was that the men of Penuel presumed the tower would protect them from both Midianite domination and from Gideon's imposing army. They placed their trust in something that they thought would save them and protect them. They placed their implicit trust in this tower that would give them a level of protection and trusting therefore in themselves. And Gideon could see the need to remove idolatry from chapter 6 in the same way that he had to now remove this tower. The only way that the men of Israel might learn to trust in Yahweh was to remove the things that they trusted in more. The men of Succoth and Penuel had the opportunity to repent, but by the time Gideon came back, they hadn't changed their ways. Perhaps, brothers and sisters, like the men of Succoth, we can perhaps be like the men of Penuel. You see, I think we can demonstrate the same spirit of indifference like these men, and we can retreat back into our ivory towers, can't we? Run away on holidays, change ecclesias to avoid conflict. We could go all sorts of different places to not enter into the battle. And if the attitude problem of Succoth was the fear of retribution, the attitude problem of the men of Penuel was retreating reluctance. Hebrews 10 verse 39 says that if we should be directly involved, we should be directly involved in the support of our brothers and sisters. But if we choose, said Hebrews 10 verse 39, to draw back unto perdition, we choose the wrong side and God will have no pleasure in us. We need to be coming out of our towers, not trusting in ourselves to support each other, not only ever just trying to retreat and to recuse ourselves from a problem because we think it's not our issue. See, the fact is, brothers and sisters, that the men of Succoth and Penuel's callous choice not to assist Gideon could have resulted in Gideon's death, or could have cost his men their life. And ultimately it cost them their own. You see, when Gideon came back, he destroyed that city and all the men in it, that Israel might learn to trust in Yahweh. Let's never isolate ourselves, brothers and sisters, but charge each other, rich in this world, that we be not high-minded, says 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 17 and 18, nor trust in uncertain riches, but in the living God who giveth us richly in all things, that we do good, and that we be rich in good works, ready to distribute, and willingly have fellowship with one another. 1 Timothy 6, verse 17 and 18. You see, neither the men of Succoth or the men of Penuel learned Jacob's lessons who had walked this journey before. You see, the man who had walked through both Succoth and Penuel had learnt to trust in God. You see, Jacob coming back from Laban, coming back into the land. He first comes to Succoth and builds booths to teach and to train his nation, or his people around him, to trust that Yahweh would protect them. That's what Succoth means, to build booths. And Jacob had learned to trust in Yahweh, that he would protect him. And then from there, he moves to Penuel. What had Jacob done with Penuel? The answer is, well, he had fought and wrestled with an angel. He'd come face to face with God. And Jacob understood that his true power was with God. And at that point, he had his name changed from Jacob to Israel, power with God, the real Ale. And Jacob had learned to stop trusting in himself and to start trusting in God. Perhaps now this is why we're told in verse 11 that Gideon went up by the way of them that dwelt in tents, brothers and sisters. Verse 11. Gideon went up by the way of them that dwelt in tents. Gideon takes off now to finish the job with the Midianites. Meanwhile, in verse 10, Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkor, and their hosts with them, about 15,000, all that were left of the children of the east, a host of the children of the east, for there fell 120,000 men. So there was 135,000 originally. 120 men had died, 15,000 left. And so Gideon goes up to finish the job. It's remarkable, isn't it? 120,000 dead, and not one man of Gideon's had passed away. God was working with them to deliver them, and utterly convinced as Gideon was, he now strikes them with full conviction and courage. Gideon's faith and trust and his confidence in his God and his ability to save was utter, so that he knew that no man could stand before him any longer. And it says in verse 11, that they dwelt, for the host was secure. And when Gideon went up, verse 11, by the way of them that dwell in tents on the east of Nobah and Jogbehah, and smote the host, for the host was secure. They thought they were safe. And when Zebah and Zalmunna fled, he pursued after them and took the 2 kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna, and discomfited all the host. They smote the host who thought they were safe. Zebah and Zalmunna tried to escape, but Gideon grabs them and discomfits them. Do you know what it means in the Hebrew? It means to be fearful. Gideon literally put the fear of God into the Midianites at this point. The fear of God was put. He discomfited them to be fearful. He puts the fear of God into them that they might never come back ever again. See, the fear that had once paralyzed a nation is now poetically reversed, and Gideon and the host are victorious. But if you thought there was time to dwell on the victory, you'd be wrong. Gideon had more work to do. He had the lessons to teach his nation. He needed all Israel to learn and to trust that Yahweh had indeed saved him, and that he needed to now teach them that they needed to learn the same lesson. And we're told, it says, Gideon, the son of Joash. You see, we have this title for him again. Why? Because he's the hewer down. He was the hewer down of idolatry. He was the hewer down of the Midianites. And he's now going to become the hewer down of those that stand in opposition against Yahweh. You see, here he is, the hewer down that was given of Yahweh. That's his full title. And here he comes to teach his people a lesson. So he comes first, back to the men of Succoth. He said to them, if you don't give me bread, then I'm going to come back and grab you and thresh you. And that's exactly what he does. He comes back, catches the young men of the men of Succoth, and inquired of them. He said, which ones are the princes and the elders? He found there were 77 of them, 70 men. And so he gathers them all up, and he says to them, verse 15, behold, Zebah and Zalmunna, here they are. These are the ones that you did upbraid me, saying, are they in your hands now, that we should give your men bread? Here they are. There's the proof. What's the proof? The proof's that Yahweh has delivered them. Come over here. Teach your lesson. And so he grabs the briars of the wilderness, and the thorns of the wilderness and the briars, and with the men he teaches, he threshes them to teach them that their brothers and sisters in need ought to be precious in their sight and to trust in Yahweh's deliverance, because he will do what he says. Yahweh will deliver us. And so he grabs the briars and teaches them a lesson. And then verse 17, he comes to the men of Penuel that says he beat down the tower of Penuel and slew the men of the city. It means to broken down and to destroy. And he did that, brothers and sisters, to teach the nation to trust in God's strength and in God's protection, to fear God, because he would say, not towers, not cities, not walls, nothing. And Gideon's transformation, brothers and sisters, from chapter 6, a worried farmer down a wine press, to a man who was prepared to take out his people in the name of his God, has been accomplished. From a weak, fearful Gideon, concerned about his father's house and the men of the city, he's now turned into a mighty man of valor who would destroy all of God's enemies, both internal and external. But Gideon's still got one more lesson to go. The lesson was for the next generation coming up underneath. So in verse 18 it says, the lesson for the next generation was you need to kill before you are killed. And I think perhaps in this verse we're now given an inkling or a clue into why Gideon had reacted the way he did in chapter 6 and verse 34, when he had blown the trumpet and gathered all of the men that were around him to battle. Because it turns out that when the Midianites had come up into the Jezreel Valley, that Gideon's own family had tried to withstand him and had potentially perished in the process. When the Midianites had raided, perhaps motivated by Gideon's own example, they'd intervened and died in the process. Look what it says. To Zebah and Zalmunna, he turns and says, "What manner of men were they whom ye slew at table?" And they answered and said, "As thou art, so were they. Each one resembled the children of a king." And he said, "Well, these were my brethren, even the sons of my mother. As Yahweh liveth, if ye had saved them, I wouldn't slay you." You see, we know, brothers and sisters, that this is a different battle than Gideon's own battle, because not one man of Gideon's 300 men died. So this battle that's being talked about happened at a previous time. Most likely the catalyst for Gideon to stand up and to blow the trumpet, because this was enough. We needed to act now. And perhaps Gideon's own family that had rallied around in fighting the enemy had perished, not with Gideon at the helm. And for this, Gideon wants to show his firstborn son how to deal with the enemy. It required complete and utter destruction without compromise or pity, else it would end in your own demise. We've lost our own brethren because we've let these men get away with it for too long. So he turns to his firstborn son and says, Jether, get up, slay them. But the youth drew not his sword, for he feared. Oh, that's an interesting expression, isn't it, brothers and sisters? He feared because he was yet a youth. Well, there's our Gideon to start with, all over again, isn't it, brothers and sisters? Gideon as a youth is manifested now in his firstborn son. He feared because he was a youth. You see, brothers and sisters, right here, Gideon knew that he had to inspire the next generation by his own example. And after waiting, perhaps trying to encourage his firstborn to try, just get on with it, do it. You need to do it, try. The youth, I can't. He grabs the sword and dispatches them and gets it. Zebah and Zalmunna say, "Rise there and fall upon us, for as a man is, so is his strength." And so Gideon rose and slew Zebah and Zalmunna and took away the ornaments that were on the camels' necks. He stood up and dispatches them to inspire the next generation to learn. You know, brothers and sisters, there's an example, there's a good lesson for us right here, right at the end of the story. There's a powerful lesson for young and for old. So for the young ones here, so sometimes, perhaps as young people, we don't fully appreciate the true challenges our older generations have fought and learned in the truth. And sometimes I think it's wise to learn from the tenacity and the wisdom of age, to appreciate what's been done for us, and for those who have gone before us, and to therefore take strength and encouragement from them to follow in their steps, and to take their wise advice, and to listen and learn. There's a lesson for the older people, isn't there, in this? That we learn to have patience with our younger folk. They don't have the same experiences, the same knowledge, the same lessons, nor have they yet failed the same ways as you might have either. But that our role and responsibilities are to teach and to inspire them, which requires our example, not our criticism. Encouraging them when, like Jether, they may struggle. Do you see, brothers and sisters, there is no condemnation from Gideon for his firstborn son. Instead, he realizes that through patience and diligence and his example, that he had to take some time to motivate and to encourage and to inspire them to see the critical lessons in the truth that he himself had been taught. So, brothers and sisters, I think we might leave the story of Gideon here at this point. That we all need to try and learn from Gideon's example. A man who God raised up, who transformed himself because his father worked in his life from a fearful farmer into a mighty warrior and man of valor, because Yahweh patiently and systematically trained him in his life. A man who turned his heart to Yahweh to finally, implicitly, and completely have faith and trust in it. So let's try and learn from Gideon, brothers and sisters, to learn from history, to look to sort things out at home so that we can help others, to endeavour to lead, therefore, by example, and to choose by attitude, not aptitude, to gain courage with God in times when we struggle, to realise that the battle has been won and that the enemy has already been overcome, and to learn in life as we do, know that the road isn't always straightforward, but that is what God has enabled for us to teach us and to learn to trust him. And that in our dealings with others, let's endeavour to pass on to each other in patience and with respect, but with intent, the many lessons that Yahweh has endeavoured to teach us in our life and in our walk in the truth, that we all together might stand shoulder to shoulders as Yahweh's host, vessels that have been turned into honour, sanctified and meet for the Master's use, and hopefully, God willing, prepared unto every good work.